ABC has been blasted by the Ukrainian ambassador over running Russian propaganda. Is this a new low for the public broadcaster? And Labor gives itself a pat on the back after electricity bills are said to fall, despite the fact that they've actually risen by $832 since the last election. Bronwyn Bishop and Steve Price will join me to discuss. Also, more bad news for housing supply as immigration far outpaces the government's ambitions for 1 million new homes. This is looking like another broken promise. But first tonight, the opposition has today demanded answers from the government over our revelation last night that the heads of ASIO and ACIS have been kicked out of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. We revealed that ASIO head Mike Burgess and ACIS chief Kerry Hartland are no longer permanent members of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. And while ASIO and ACIS are on the outer, tonight I can reveal that there's a new attendee to the National Security Committee of Cabinet, and that is the Climate Change Department Secretary, David Fredericks. That's right. It seems that climate change is in, while ASIO and ACIS are out. Now, Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen and the Labor government declined to answer our repeated questions about this today. But the move is in line with Albanese wasting the Director General of the Office of National Intelligence's time with a climate change review. Andrew Shearer had to prepare a complex and long climate change review while at the same time juggling terror threats, as he himself acknowledged in a rare public comment.
It's widely known before the election, the now government committed to a major assessment on the national security implications of climate change. So we have to be able to do that while at the same time warning about the possibility of a terror attack.
So now ASIO and ACIS have been booted off the National Security Committee while the Climate Change Secretary has attended, my sources tell me. Well, this is utterly irrational, illogical and nonsensical. It's a warped government that would prefer climate change advice to that from the top spy chiefs. The ASIO Director General Mike Burgess protects Australia from acts of foreign interference, from attacks on our defence system, espionage, terrorism and threats to border integrity. And the Australian Secret Intelligence Service Director General Kerry Hartland is in charge of our overseas secret intelligence agency, collecting foreign intelligence to protect our security. Yet they're no longer automatic, permanent members of the premier National Security Forum to give advice on urgent threats. Instead, they're invited in on a case-by-case basis. And this is the mob making decisions on our national security that think they know better than ASIO and ACIS. The permanent members of the National Security Committee of Cabinet include Anthony Albanese, Richard Marles, Penny Wong, Jim Chalmers, Chris Bowen, the Climate Change Minister, Mark Dreyfus, Claire O'Neill, Katie Gallagher and Pat Conroy. Well, you wouldn't trust most of this lot to run a school fete, let alone make decisions about national security without our intelligence chiefs present. Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson joked that we should all feel safe now because Chris Bowen has become a member of the Security Committee of Cabinet.
Director Generals of ASIO and ACIS have been replaced on the committee by the Minister for Energy and Climate Change, Chris Bowen. Now, Chris Bowen obviously has much more insight to share on national security and intelligence than the heads of our intelligence agencies who are involved day-to-day in collecting intelligence both offshore and onshore against the terrorism, foreign interference and espionage threats that our country faces.
And that was Paterson speaking about our exclusive revelations from last night with my colleague Peter Credlin earlier this evening. Now, I have confirmed that the intelligence community has serious concerns about the approach the Albanese government is taking to national security and particularly China. And the intelligence community is itself now speculating about the future of both Mike Burgess and Andrew Shearer. There's discussion that their appointments may not be renewed when their terms are up, later this year for Burgess, and early next year for Shearer. James Paterson has called today on Anthony Albanese to reverse the decision to take the heads of ACIS and ASIO off the National Security Committee of Cabinet. Now, James Paterson was speaking to radio host Ray Hadley, who said the fact that they had been dumped was highly concerning.
It's most enlightening to think that back in September 2001, 23 years ago, probably one of our most remarkable Prime Ministers, John Howard, said, no, this is really important. I need to have these people in the meeting. And now in 2024, it's not so important.
It's very worrying that the Albanese government doesn't think it needs the most up-to-date, in-person expert advice on national security. I cannot think of one detriment that occurs from having them in the room. And frankly, because this Prime Minister has the worst instincts on national security, because he has no interest in national security or foreign policy or defence policy, he, more than anyone else, needs to have them in the room to provide their advice so that he can hear it, because frankly, left to his own devices, he's not going to make the right decisions when it comes to national security. He's demonstrated that time and time again.
Now, while the government didn't bother to answer questions about why the Climate Change Secretary had attended the NSC, they did respond to our questions over Peter Varghese. The Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet defended the unusual decision to put Varghese in charge of a review of government funding for think tanks, given he already chairs a separate think tank. As you'll recall, one of China's list of 14 demands to Australia under the coalition government was that the anti-China Australian Strategic Policy Institute be scrapped. Well, we put questions to Glyn Davis about why he'd appointed Peter Varghese to conduct a review into the funding of think tanks, including the US-funded ASPI, when he's the chair of another think tank, AsiaLink. A spokesperson for the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet said that all conflicts of interest had been disclosed. They said, and I quote, that Mr Varghese's extensive career in the public service has included senior positions in foreign affairs, trade policy and intelligence. This makes him uniquely skilled and experienced for the role. Australian government procurement policy requires any conflict of interest, perceived or actual, to be disclosed before a contract commences. Now, we can take this to mean that the perceived conflict of interest had been disclosed by Varghese himself. But if there is a disclosure, that's Peter Varghese meeting his obligations. But what about the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet? Have they required Varghese to stand down from his role as chair of AsiaLink while he's conducting this review into the Commonwealth funding of think tanks? Well, it doesn't appear so. The ultimate picture here is that the Albanese government is deprioritising national security. The two most powerful and important jobs in national security no longer automatically invited to the National Security Committee of Cabinet. You have to wonder whether it's because they're giving the government the truth about the threats to our national security, which isn't necessarily what the Albanese government wants to hear. Mike Burgess said just recently in his annual threat assessment that Islamic terror was the top terror threat and that foreign interference was the key security concern for Australia's sovereignty. He didn't mention climate change once. Yet neither of those two major threats facing Australia, the real threat of Islamic terror and foreign interference, seem to be on the Albanese government's agenda. They rarely, if ever, speak about Islamic terror, and they've all but stopped criticising China in public. Our government is behaving like the three wise monkeys who see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, covering their eyes and ears to the major threats, the real evil threatening our nation. No revelation more accurately reflects this attitude than literally removing from their National Security Forum the top two individuals charged with keeping us all safe. All right, to have a look at this and the rest of the day's top stories, I'm joined now by Sky News host Steve Price in Melbourne and former Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop. Terrific to see you both. Bronwyn, let me start with you. What's your reaction to this revelation that the top two security chiefs, ASIO and ACIS, have been taken off the National Security Committee of Cabinet as permanent members, and instead they're only invited in on a case-by-case basis.
It reaffirms all the concerns I've always had about Elbow the Trot. Trot standing for Trotsky. This is the most appalling decision I think I've seen this government make, because it really does put us at risk. This is a whole body of information that is gathered together so that the right decisions can be made, and they're now excluded. So when we look at Albanese, he came from the far left. He was far, far left, hence his nickname, Elbow the Trot. He hasn't changed his spots at all. China is no longer criticised. Is the fact that we've made these changes, is that the reason that China's now thinking of allowing wine back into China with a reduced tariff rate? Is it the reason for the visit we're having at the moment? What other concessions has he made? And when you look at the speech that was made by the head of ASIO very recently, saying that he knows who, a former politician who let his country right down, who betrayed the country, perhaps we might find out if he's not reappointed. Maybe he made that statement for a good reason. But I am just appalled at the direction that this government is going in all the decisions it's making. It is making this country vulnerable. And China wants us as a vassal state. Is this the first step with the kowtowing that Albanese has done to enable it to happen?
Look, I have to say, Steve, what most concerns me about all of this is the fact that we are seeing this silence on China from the Prime Minister and from Penny Wong. They rarely criticise China in public anymore. And instead, we had the Trade Minister, Don Farrell, say just yesterday that New Zealand was now our most trusted ally. That's nonsense. It's plainly untrue. But he said it the same week that China's Foreign Minister is arriving in Australia.
Well, that's right. Congratulations on breaking this very important story. And I think what we're seeing here, obviously, is the Albanese government trying to change the narrative on China, and that should worry all of us. Bronwyn's correct. I do note that our colleague Peter Credlin, I think, said something very important on her program tonight. And unlike me or you, Sharri, I don't know about Bronwyn, we've not sat in that National Security Committee room. Peter has, and Peter made the point that often the head of ASIO or the head of ASIS, who is in that room, would often stop the rest of the public servants and politicians in their steps by making a statement about something that none of them knew about, that was obviously very important, that the country needed to know about. And so it seems to be madness, complete madness, that you have qualified heads of ASIS and ASIO excluded from a security meeting. I mean, they're the first people that you would want in the room, and you would want to listen to them. And when Burgess made that speech that Bronwyn referred to there about the former politician, maybe he stepped on a few toes. But maybe he did that deliberately, because it seems he's been excluded for some time.
Yes.
But this is dreadful for the Albanese government, and it's a great opening for Peter Dutton and the coalition, who can again go back and attack this government over their lack of detail on border security and national security.
Imagine being so arrogant as the Prime Minister or Foreign Minister or Richard Marles that you wouldn't want the head of ASIO and ASIS in that room on a permanent basis. And, you know, as some of my sources have said to me, you know, it's all very well inviting them in on a case-by-case basis, but you don't know when there might be a matter that they do have expertise in, that they can just offer unsolicited advice. But clearly the government doesn't want that. Now, let's move on to electricity prices. The energy regulator today announced that power bills would be reduced and that the relief would be modest for most households. But at the same time, the Australian reported today that electricity bills have increased by as much as $832 since the last election. This is massive, Bronwyn.
Absolutely. I mean, this is deliberate policy again. The cost of electricity is driven by government policy. And this lie that is told, that renewables are the cheapest form of energy, is just that, a lie, because you have to cost in the poles and wires, the building of the new infrastructure, all of that is part of the cost of enabling power from wind and solar to get to your house or somebody's business. And that's not being done. You also have to cost in the cost of prime land, which is now being destroyed by great panels destroying the earth and the ability to grow food. That's another cost. So there's no proper debate about renewable energy in this country at all. And the government and the opposition is quite right when they say we must have base load. It can only come from coal or from nuclear power. There's a place for windmills and solar panels, but it is fed into every aspect. It feeds into inflation, it feeds into the supermarket costs, it feeds into the price of plants in Bunnings. It absolutely feeds into everything. Yeah. And it's a deliberate policy by that idiot Bowen, who honestly has stuffed up everything he's ever touched.
Steve Price, I mean, no one plays the clips more than my mate Paul Murray about Albanese promising that electricity prices would be $275 cheaper before the last election. And yet today we learn that actually they're $870 more expensive.
Well, that's the point. I mean, when we talk about these decreases in prices announced today, that's the wholesale price. I mean, the retailers don't have to pass those prices on. They probably will. But we're talking about peanuts. I mean, remember, Sharri, we used to have, you know, when you had a federal budget, you'd have a milkshake budget tax cut. Well, this is $1, $2, $3 a week that you're going to get less on your electricity bill. It's not the $270, and even the $270 wasn't a hell of a lot. Robin makes a point there that what the government's going to try and do here is sneak through to the next election. They'll try and cover their backsides on that $270 promise, and they'll get to the next election. Then after that election, if they're re-elected for another 4 years, all of these new transmission lines are going to have to be spread across the country. The cost of those will then go into the electricity cost, and our prices will spike again. Don't fall for it, folks. This is a con.
Now, I think this is quite a big story. The Ukraine's ambassador, oh, by the way, I should say that was $832 that our electricity prices have reportedly increased by, not $870. Now, Ukraine's ambassador to Australia has criticised the ABC after last night's Four Corners episode that I'm sure none of us were watching. I certainly wasn't. I was watching Sky News, as always. But the episode bizarrely focused on a human perspective on life on the Russian front line. Now, the Ukrainian ambassador accuses the ABC of running Russian propaganda. He says that the program aired last night on Four Corners was the journalistic equivalent of a bowl of vomit. He says it unquestioningly repeated and aired countless blatant lies, historical distortions, racist claims and propaganda narratives emanating from the Kremlin. He says the ABC should be ashamed that it put such total garbage to air. And he's now demanded a meeting with both the ABC boss and executive producer to question them about why they could broadcast this on the taxpayer-funded broadcaster. Bronwyn, this seems to be a new low for the ABC, just blatantly running Russian propaganda, according to the Ukrainian ambassador.
Well, I don't know it's a new low. I think they've sunk pretty low. I did two things this afternoon when I knew we were going to talk about it. I never watched the ABC. The only part of the ABC I listen to is Classic FM. But the other thing to say is this. I also took a look at the ABC Charter again. Now, this was the equivalent of, if you were in World War II, going and behind the lines with a German soldier to say, this is the life of a German soldier in battle. I mean, it is running Russian propaganda to say these nice chaps are just fighting because they have to fight. I mean, it really is an insult to this country. But look at what the Labor government did. Refused to send those helicopters that we no longer wanted to the Ukraine and let them deal with them. What did they do? They dismantled them and buried them. So where is the truth of their attitude? And if you look at the ABC Charter, we'll never get anywhere with the ABC until it's enforceable at law, because it's Section 6 of the ABC Act, And the last subsection of that section says that no legal action can be brought to enforce the Charter. Now, until that is changed and there is real accountability, nothing is going to change.
Steve, it seems like the ABC is so quick to run, you know, the Russian line, so quick to run anti-Israel accusations. You know, why do you think they take this position? Why can't they just run straight, credible, objective news reports?
They'd be sitting in ABC headquarters tonight saying that what they did last night was balanced out the previous reporting from the Ukrainian side of this war, which is complete nonsense. I mean, I'm loath to suggest this, Sharri, because some bright spark at the ABC will probably do it, but what are we going to see next? A special with a reporter embedded with Hamas to tell the Hamas side of the conflict with Israel? Is that going to happen next? I mean, it probably will. I didn't watch it either, but I have seen the edited highlights of what they put to air. We've been covering the Ukraine war now for 2 years. It's an illegal invasion. The Russians are butchers. They went in there and tortured people. The torture was dreadful. It happened. It's been proven. And they should be ashamed of themselves running that. And God forbid that they do the same thing with Hamas.
Steve Price, Bronwyn Bishop, thank you both so much for joining me. Now, coming up, Anthony Albanese's flawed approach to national security. Well, climate change is in, as we've discussed. Michael Shoebridge is going to join me to discuss this. Plus, migration booms in another broken election promise, and it's affecting our housing supply. Terry McCrann will be up next. Welcome back. Well, we're returning to our top story that the heads of ASIO and ACIS are no longer permanent members of the National Security Committee of Cabinet, and how disturbing it is that our government seems to place more importance on climate change advice rather than terrorism, foreign interference and espionage. Joining me now is Strategic Analysis Australia Director Michael Shoebridge. Michael, thank you very much for your time this evening. Look, how concerned are you by these revelations that the Albanese government doesn't want our top intelligence chiefs permanently in the National Security Committee of Cabinet?
Well, Sharri, I think it fits with a pattern where the Albanese government has a view of the world as they would like it to be, and they don't like inconvenient truths. So when you read documents that they put out saying we're in the most dangerous strategic environment since the Second World War, they clearly don't believe their own words. We'll see this on real display with the visit of the Chinese foreign minister. You would not know that the Chinese state and its military is threatening peace in our region from the happy snaps and handshakes we're going to see with this visit over the rest of the week. So not wanting advice from our intelligence chiefs is an indicator that they don't want to listen to the advice. So don't have them in the room to give it.
Exactly. And as I've reported tonight, there's increasing speculation from within the intelligence community that Mike Burgess and Andrew Shearer, who are two of the two most experienced intelligence operatives that we have serving at the moment, there's increasing speculation that they might not be reappointed. You know, obviously I don't expect you to comment on that speculation, but how much weaker would our national security be without these eminent professionals leading these two agencies?
Well, Sharri, it would be weakened. But the disturbing thing is this idea that if we don't hear the analysis, it isn't happening. You can't stick your fingers in your ears and silence the world. So it shows the government is determined on a policy approach regardless of what the world actually looks like.
And so why add Chris Bowen and his department secretary to the National Security Committee of Cabinet? I mean, how does climate change come into the top priorities in terms of our threats to our nation when Mike Burgess, in his own threat assessment, he didn't mention climate change once. Instead, he mentioned as the top terror threat, Islamic terrorism, and as the top security threat to our sovereignty, foreign interference. And he made it clear afterwards that that was China.
Yes, well, climate change can drive other security problems. It can mean that there are more conflicts and there's more people movement. But unless you've got people making sense of that from a national security perspective, it's like one hand clapping to have Chris Bowen in the room. So I think it's a disturbing downplaying of real national security challenges and threats and an attempt to just put them in the background and hope they go away.
Look, let's have a look at one of the UN bodies now. The UN is becoming increasingly discredited, and in an alarming move, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been appointed the presidency of the United Nations Conference on Disarmament. This is a joke. Now, this is a rotating position, and it'll keep Iran in control over the international body. Michael, how can these bodies function with Iran heading the UN Agency for Disarmament? It's actually ludicrous and unthinkable.
Well, Sharri, this is not a lonely event. China has a seat on the UN Human Rights Council. There was a Chinese head of Interpol, the International Police Agency, until he was recalled to China and disappeared, like the previous Chinese foreign minister. So having Iran, a burglar when it comes to disarmament, chairing the UN conference is no more absurd than what's happening on human rights or Interpol. It just shows the world's lost its way when it comes to the UN. The UN is meant to be able to speak truth to autocrats and repressive regimes rather than pretend they're the opposite of what they are.
Yeah, exactly right. Now, quickly, before we go, Israel is sending a delegation to the United States to discuss an alternative to a military offensive in the southern city of Rafah in Gaza. But at the same time, we've seen that Benjamin Netanyahu has declared he's not going to succumb to international pressure and take his foot off Hamas. What do you think we're seeing here? I mean, clearly Joe Biden is going down this path, at least in part, for political reasons. But do you think this delegation indicates that Israel might start to cave in to some of his demands?
I don't think Israel can stop fighting the war against Hamas until it's dismantled the remaining Hamas organisation that is in Rafah. So I don't think that is going to happen. A lot of this is, as you say, about the domestic politics of the different countries rather than thinking about what's going to work in the Middle East. I think there's way too much of this performance from Western leaders, and we forget what war looks like. Israel's in the middle of a war, and there's a humanitarian crisis as a result. But Netanyahu is a bit like Margaret Thatcher, isn't he? The lady's not for turning.
Well, you know, he is a very controversial figure, but at this point, I mean, who doesn't support the destruction of Hamas and the return of the hostages? No one sensible, that's for sure. Michael Shoebridge, thank you very much for your time tonight. Now, let's move on to the immigration debate. The Australian today has revealed that migrants are arriving into Australia at nearly 4 times the pace that new homes are being built. So, in other words, for the 900,000 permanent and long-term immigrants that arrived here between July 2022 and December last year, there were only 265,000 buildings built. Now, radio host Ben Fordham today pointed out that this is a far cry from the government's promise to bring migration back to sustainable levels.
In January alone, Labor brought in more than the entire population of Dubbo. They brought in the combined population of Moree, Gunnedah, Mudgee, Cooma and Yass. That's almost 1,800 people every single day. Now, if Labor was to continue bringing in so many people at this rate for the rest of the year, we'd take in a record 664,000 people in 2024. That's almost double the population of Canberra. It's 5 times the number of people living in Darwin. It's more than 3 times the population of Hobart. And remember, nobody voted for it.
Very good point. Nobody voted for it. Well, let's bring in now Herald Sun columnist Terry McCrann. Terry, there seems to be so many nation-defining policies like this Big Australia plan that was actually never taken to the election.
Well, exactly, Sharri. They weren't taken to the election, but also there's been absolutely zero thought behind what's unfolded since the election. We've had this massive explosion in migration taking place, immigration into Australia. Let me add to the numbers that Ben Fordham was talking. You put what's in prospect for this year together with the numbers that flowed in last year, over 500,000 new migrants in 2023. That's about the population of Adelaide in 2 years. Wow. So we've really got, if you had any sort of planning, any sort of thought process behind this, you would have set in train policies which would enable the houses to be built to house these migrants, apart from everything else in terms of the impact on the economy, on inflation, on demand for infrastructure, all those things, just the basic reality of where will these people live. You need to build probably twice as many houses that we're on track to build over the course of 2023 and 2024. But not only have you got this flood of migrants coming in, you've got various governments doing all sorts of things to make it even more difficult to build those houses.
So, Terry, explain to us why the government did this. I mean, experts are saying it was clearly a high immigration strategy to keep us out of recession. But the fact that there are so many more people here means we're in a per capita recession, means that there's a devastating shortage of places for people to live in. And we're seeing families, even if they have full-time jobs, for the first time, kept out of the housing market, out of the rental market, and living in tents.
Well, there was clearly no strategy, Sharri, in any sensible way that word might be used. The government clearly had this idea that if they opened the doors to migrants, this would provide the labour that was needed across the economy. I mean, we saw coming out of COVID massive shortages of workers in all sorts of areas, and particularly in hospitality and retail, those sorts of areas. The difficulty of getting, putting it very simply, getting enough baristas, getting enough chefs, getting those sorts of people working in the economy, because we'd relied so much on those migrants, on those short-term migrants, the backpackers, the students, to fill those jobs. So in a very simplistic way, the government thought if we open the doors, we'll have all these migrants flowing in, it'll provide the labour. It will also, as you say, boost economic activity, because migrants add to demand. They have to be fed, they have to be housed, et cetera, et cetera. They use resources. But they had no sense of, OK, we do this, but we've got to manage it. We've got to put in place processes for controlling how many visas are issued and how many people come in each week, each month, each year. And it's just got completely out of hand. And clearly the numbers have accelerated in the first 2 months of 2024 on what were already ludicrously high numbers all the way through 2023.
Now, just before you go, Terry, I just wanted to ask your view on the bigger picture of our economy. We saw today that the Reserve Bank left the cash rate on hold at 4.35%, but there wasn't really any clear direction. The RBA governor said she's not ruling anything in or out. So what's your sense? Are we going to see rates fall, or is inflation still quite sticky?
Well, Sharri, I mean, what we saw from Michelle Bullock today was a half pivot. Previously, the February meeting, the Reserve Bank was talking about possible future rate hikes. Economists and commentators and the markets have been waiting for her to do a full pivot to start talking about rate cuts, just as the Fed has done in America. She didn't do that. She went halfway. She said, I'm not ruling anything in, I'm not ruling anything out. And I think that's sensible, because the economy, in my judgment, is teetering. But it's teetering on the basis that it can go one of two ways. We can either see the economy hit the brick wall, and therefore you would have to have rate cuts, or we can see a resurgence in inflation, or it remains too stickily too high. So that's why Michelle Bullock has stopped going all the way to talking about rate cuts. It's only a half pivot. We really will have to see how this plays out over the next few weeks.
Well, I mean, the other benefit of her not committing to a position is that she can't be accused of giving wrong advice, as her predecessor Philip Lowe was over and over again. We gave him such a hard time in the media. Terry McCrann, thank you so much for joining me. Now, coming up, Labor again on the back foot when it comes to freed foreign criminals, with the government rushing to settle these detainee cases out of the courtroom. My political panel will join me next. Welcome back. Well, concerns grew in Parliament today around Labor's ability to curb the detainee crisis, with news that the measures the government has put in place to keep people safe, the ankle bracelets, the curfews, now all could face legal challenges. If courts order them to be scrapped, the question remains, and this is what the Coalition has been asking today: what is Labor's plan to keep Australians safe? Well, let's bring in our political panel, Federal Labor MP Daniel Molino and National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie. Welcome to you both. Bridget, the Coalition again on the attack over this issue of the released criminal detainees today. What are your concerns over whether the ankle bracelets and the other measures will be able to protect the community?
Yeah, Sharri, it's great to be with you. Well, on each and every measure in the debacle that has unfolded over the last 6 months, of the incompetency of not just Minister Giles, but I would suggest also Minister O'Neill, this government's ability to keep us safe and to keep us informed. Remember, they assured the Australian public prior to Christmas that they had it all under control, despite the High Court ruling, that everyone was wearing the ankle bracelets, that we knew where all the pedophiles were, that we knew where all the alleged murderers and rapists were. Turns out they don't. And turns out they haven't got a plan B to actually not only just assure the Australian public about their safety, but what are they going to do on the trajectory of ensuring these detainees are either exported to their country of birth or that they are adequately detained here at home to secure our safety as a community?
Daniel, can you respond to this from Bridget about what the plan B is? But also the media reports today that a barrister has said the Commonwealth has covertly settled at least 3 High Court matters to avoid embarrassing losses.
Well, hi, Sharri, and great to be here. And you won't be surprised to hear that I don't agree with that characterisation at all. And so what we have to go back to is the fact that the government opposed the High Court's decision and argued against it. And moreover, that the government continues to strongly argue against further releases. But we should go back to the fact that the High Court is independent and no government, no parliament, no minister is above rulings of the High Court. You know, I started out my career in Attorney Generals, but sometimes in the House of Reps during question time, the way that questions are phrased, the way that comments come across the chamber, you'd think that complying with High Court decisions was some kind of discretion or whim of the government. I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous.
You knew this was going to happen, and frankly, you set us up to fail.
It's very irresponsible, frankly, the way that the opposition is characterising this. But, you know, if we want to go back to legal advice, what I find particularly irresponsible from those opposite isn't just the kind of statements Bridget just made, but they're refusing to be briefed. They're refusing to be briefed.
Is that true?
On the details of this.
Is that true, Bridget McKenzie?
They've been offered briefs for weeks and they are not taking it up.
No, it's not, Sharri. Absolutely not. We've sought briefings. Our Shadow Attorney General, Mikhail Yakash and Dan Tehan have sought briefings. We want the logistics to mean let's have the briefings this week in Canberra. The fact is you scheduled the... Sorry, Molino. You scheduled the briefings in a way that someone that has to travel 7 hours to actually receive the briefing. Have the briefing this week in Canberra when the Shadow Ministers are actually available with the bureaucrats. What the Labor Party offered was a briefing that our shadow ministers couldn't actually get to. And that's the reality of the Labor Party. They don't want to have us having the full information available to us. And it's nice for you to trot out the talking points from Dreyfus. Well done. Your pre-selection's guaranteed. But the Australian public deserves more, Mr Merlino, and you, if you're fronting up on this program, should actually deliver that.
Well, let's just say in question time today, the minister had said that he had offered on multiple occasions that the offer is standing for a briefing. There was silence. Crickets
today.
On the other side. No, he's been offering
Make it while they're in Canberra today.
Weeks. Okay, let's see next time we come on this show. Let's see next time we come on this show if the opposition has accepted the briefing. Let's see if it happens this week. We're all here.
All right, well, we'll come back to this next Wednesday because, next Tuesday night on our political panel. I can't remember which day of the week it is already. The week's flying. Now, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has said that he's not going to push ahead with his election promise to change religious freedoms unless he has bipartisan support. Daniel, can you tell us the thinking behind this?
Well, look, I think this is clearly a very important issue. It's an important issue to me, and can I say it's a very important issue to the people in my electorate. I have an electorate with many people from a range of faith-based communities. The Australian Law Reform Commission is currently looking at some of the details of this, but this is an issue that I would hope, especially in the environment that our community finds itself in, where there has been a range of tensions rising over recent months, where there's been anti-Semitism, where there's been Islamophobia, where this is the kind of issue which we want to undertake.
Well, I don't think the main issue has been...
I think it's anti-Semitism. Let's actually put that on the table. Honestly, you're here tonight. I've just got back from Israel. I've actually seen the live footage of the Hamas atrocities on October the 7th, the uncensored version. And you're here arguing that there's been Islamophobia? Seriously?
I'm answering the question, Bridget, and I'm seriously engaging on the fact that on the specific issue of whether we can achieve bipartisanship, the PM's point was that he and the Leader of the Opposition have been seeking for some time to reach bipartisanship. My understanding is there have been good faith engagement on this issue. I think the serious point he was raising is that if we can't reach bipartisanship, this is the kind of issue at this point which we'd have to seriously ask, is it sensible to pursue this at this point?
Isn't that interesting? It's so hard to govern, isn't it, Daniel?
Bridget, I have to just say that thank you for making that trip to Israel, by the way, and for pointing out correctly that the main issue we're facing at the moment is an explosion in anti-Semitism, not just in Australia, but globally. That's not to say there's not some instances of Islamophobia, but it's not the overwhelming racist movement that we are seeing. But Bridget, if Albanese is saying that he's not going to press ahead with this unless he has bipartisan support, does the coalition support the changes?
Oh, look, can I just say, Sharri, and all the difficult measures that our government, previous government actually was challenged by over nearly a decade, if we had have said we seek bipartisan support on every one of those, I can tell you what,
you didn't introduce
whether it was Anthony Albanese or Bill Shorten, they would have said no. This guy, this Prime Minister, when he was opposition leader, he rejected bipartisanship on this issue. En masse. Now that he's Prime Minister, he's demanding blind bipartisanship. That is outrageous. What Australian families, what our faith leaders are seeking from this government is the fact that our schools of faith can actually hire teachers of faith. That's not a big ask. And the fact that this Prime Minister is asking us to sign up blindly to a bipartisanship pact without having seen the actual legislation, without being able to talk to faith leaders who've been gagged through this process, is unconscionable on an issue of this magnitude at this time. And I think it shows that old Albo just doesn't have the spine for a fight.
Well, he doesn't want perhaps this fight at this time before the next election. Bridget McKenzie and Daniel Merlino, really appreciate you both joining me, and have to say, Bridget, that was a very fiery performance. Now, after the break, the New South Wales Police Commissioner has appointed a new spin doctor to clean up her mess, but the move has been met with controversy. We'll talk about it after the break. Welcome back. Well, the embattled New South Wales Police Commissioner Karen Webb has already appointed a new PR chief after only reportedly starting the hiring process on Monday. Veteran journalist Steve Jackson will step in as her fourth spin doctor in just 2 years. You might remember that he was the Channel 7 producer behind Spotlight's Bruce Lerman interview. Joining me now is the Daily Telegraph's James O'Doherty. Thank you so much for your time, James.
Good evening, Sharri.
This has already been quite a controversial appointment. Ben Fordham spoke about it on 2GB this morning, and he said that police insiders are raising their eyebrows over the choice. Why has it been so controversial?
Well, Sharri, you're right. I mean, if this was supposed to be an attempt at a clean break for the police commissioner to fix one of her biggest problems, which is communicating with the public, it seems to have backfired. In fact, it's kind of gone bananas in the last 24 hours or so. The issue here, one of the issues here, is that we reported in the paper that the senior government officials started sounding people out for the job of the chief spinner for the police commissioner, the head of public affairs, on or about February 29. Problem is, the job already had an incumbent, Liz Deegan. She wasn't told until a couple of weeks later that her services were no longer required. Now, ultimately, it ended in Steve Jackson being the man tapped for that job. I don't know Steve Jackson, but a lot of people in media circles do, which is why it seemed to ricochet around media circles after it emerged that he was one that had the job. Also, a lot of senior police officers were unaware that this change was happening either. So plenty of questions that still remain unanswered, specifically what the involvement of Police Minister Yasmin Catley's office was in all of this. Her office is so far not commenting, Sharri.
Yeah, look, neither Yasmin Catley or the police commissioner are doing a very good job, and I don't think any spin doctor, Liz Deegan or Steve Jackson, no matter how good they are, can fix the nonsense that comes out of Karen Webb's mouth. Now to another story. The New South Wales Local Government Minister Ron Honig is under fire for using TikTok on a phone that he uses for work. As we know, the US is so concerned about the app that it's looking at banning it. That ban's already passed through the House of Reps in the US, but not yet the Senate. James, doesn't this breach both the New South Wales and federal government's own social media rules?
Well, on the technicality, Ron Honig says that he's in the clear because he doesn't get his ministerial emails to his mobile phone. He just gets his parliamentary emails to his mobile phone. That seems a bit too cute by half. And, I mean, this whole thing seems a little bit trite when you consider the kind of content that Ron Honig is sharing on his TikTok, but it's actually fairly serious, particularly when you consider some of your reporting on the last 2 nights. I mean, our intelligence agencies were so concerned that they moved to ban government officials using TikTok on official phones. New South Wales echoed that federal ban. The federal ban has specific rules in place for TikTok. When you use it, it has to be on a standalone device that doesn't have any access to official government information. Meanwhile, Ron Honig is still sharing TikTok videos and has the app on his one mobile phone, which he says is not a government-issued phone, but he gets parliamentary emails to it. It seems that the best thing for Ron Honig to do would be to get a second device or potentially just discontinue his TikTok habit, because if the intelligence agencies are so worried about this app and the potential ramifications of it, maybe Ron Honig should listen.
Absolutely. He can't be that. Surely he's too busy then to just sit around watching people dancing or whatever they do on TikTok. James O'Doherty, thanks for your time. Thanks so much for your company tonight. Here's Paul Murray.